Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I would like to talk more about the bean lifecycle, and I want to introduce you the concept of hooks, meaning the methods that we can create that can be called automatically by Spring when a bean is created and before the bean is destroyed. And they are really useful when you need to initialize things, most of the time external things, and we want to make sure that they are clean or close at the end before the bean is destroyed. And I will provide you several ways to do it. Some of them are quite modern using annotations, but we can also apply this concept to legacy beans or legacy classes that are not beans, not managed by Spring Boot, but we can ask Spring Boot to manage those classes also. Let's see how. So what is a bean lifecycle? Spring Bean goes through different phases like instantiation, meaning creating the object in Java, because Spring Boot works inside Java. Then there is the dependency injection. Most of the times it happens almost at the same time. So when we call the constructor, most of the dependency injection happens if you are using constructor injection by injecting dependencies on the constructor. And then the step 3, this is what this video is about. It's just we can add a method that will be called by Spring on this step 3. And then we use the object, and then we have also this step 5, where before the bean is destroyed, we can also ask Spring Boot to call specific methods in our bean. And usually we call these methods hooks, but if you call them callbacks, it's also correct. So why should you care about these initializations? Well, mainly you want to manage resource. I remember that in some projects I created, one of them is about telecommunications, and when the application started, I want to initialize all the application, first create all the components, and then I need to initialize a few of them, creating threads, making sure that some folders exist, because I will receive files in those folders and process those files and then move the files to a specific place. And when the application ends, it will be useful to probably take the files that were not, for instance, processed, move to a different folder, and clean all these structures that was created on the disk to make sure that the project understood how to clean everything. So if I have to start again, it will be, let's say, an idempotent operation, meaning that even if I start 10 times, the application still works as expected. And usually you cannot accomplish this with just a constructor, because you have the constructor but you don't have the destructor. Of course, you have Java provides ways to work around this, like interface, like auto-closable and things like that. But in Spring Boot, there are elegant ways to do it, and that's what we are talking about in this video. So the first one that I want to introduce is the PostConstruct. And at the end of the day, you just create a method. You add this annotation in a managed bean, meaning that it's a bean that is recognized by Spring. It has the annotation component or a service or repository and so on. Okay, and this method will be the one called here on step 3, meaning after the dependency injection, okay, Spring Boot will call this method. Great tool connecting to services, validating dependencies, preparing state, and things like that. Of course, you have the counterpart, meaning if you add this annotation PreDestroy in a method, this method will be called before the application is graceful shutdown. And this graceful is quite important because you have different ways to stop an application in Spring Boot. But if you just stop the application normally using an event, it's something that I will talk in a future video, how to shut down Spring Boot application. But even if you do Control-C or in the IDE, you stop the application, it's a graceful shutdown. Even on the output, and I will show you in the practice in a moment, you can see that even Spring Boot writes graceful shutdown, because in graceful shutdown, Spring Boot will call this method. If the shutdown is not graceful, it will not be called. So how Spring handles this? So it first instantiates the constructor, because at the end of the day, Spring Boot works inside Java. There is no special or magic constructor in Spring Boot. Now inject the dependencies and now invoke the method under the PostConstruct. Now the bean is ready. Then before the bean is destroyed, it will look for methods with the annotation PreDestroy and will call them before the bean is destroyed, of course. So let's say an implementation, an example. So you have a component, so it's a managed bean here, Now imagine that we have a constructor that injected this data source. I didn't put here the code to not occupy too much space, but imagine this data source was injected here. And now we have this PostConstruct that after the injection is executed, okay, is applied, then I can use now the data source. And for instance, I create a pool and associate with this data source. And then here on the destroy, it's before the destroy. In this case, we can even ignore completely the injection of data source, just a regular data source, because this create pool can create the data source and assign to this one, and then it will close the data source before the bin is destroyed. Remember, the bin here, it's a singleton. So this it only creates one data source and will close this data source. Caching layer, it's a quite common for this in this case. So we have the cache here, which is a map, and in this case, when we start the application, maybe we want to go to the database and load some data like countries and information that we know that don't change a lot, and you put in cache to make our application faster. So we put on the load date, and again, this component works as a singleton. You don't have to implement the singleton pattern. The component, it's already a singleton pattern. Of course, you must be careful if you put these attributes here with if you have a multi-threading here, maybe you want to use a different type here rather than hash map. I think there is one called concurrent hash map or something like that. I don't remember by heart, but I think I'm not mistaken here. But I know for sure that exists specific maps on the Java to avoid concurrency problems. Probably it's something that you want here if you are using this cache server for multiple threading. But again, you have the PostConstruct to load the data, and then you want to clean the cache. Why do you want to clean the cache? Maybe the cache clear here. It's not a reason, because at the end of the day, the garbage collector will remove everything from the memory. But imagine that part of this cache, the cache here, it's not a hash in memory, but it's a database or a file system. And sometimes it's necessary, it's an Excel system. And maybe you want to load from there, and this load data takes data from database, it put in a specific distributed cache or a file system close to your application, or distribute for several folders for other applications to use. Of course, at the end, you want to clear and clean everything that you created on the load data. When are they called? Again, in summaries, so PostConstruct is called after all properties are set. And this is quite important to understand, this concept of after all properties are set. The ones that belong to Java and the others that belong to Spring, meaning the injected ones. And the PreDestroy is called only during graceful shutdown. Again, only during graceful shutdown. Not called in force exit. If, for instance, you call system exit, this is a very hard call. It will just close your application instantly, so Spring Boot will never have the time to first to capture this, because it's not in the control of the Spring Boot, the system exit. That's the first thing. Okay, so, and it's a Java thing, so Spring Boot will never understood what happened. Common pitfalls only worked in Spring managed beans. The PreDestroy, of course, the PostConstruct and PreDestroy. It won't trigger for new beans if the class was created, even if it contains the annotation. But to use new, it's not a Spring thing, it's a Java thing, meaning that when you use new, you are saying that you are managing the bin, not Spring Boot. Okay, it's outside of Spring. PostConstruct can't handle async init, doesn't participate in async operations, okay, and not suitable for complex shutdown orchestration, meaning don't try to infer any sequence logic between different PostConstructs and different bins. Don't assume that. Maybe you can guess somehow, say, okay, this bin depends on this one, but since everything happens after the injections, it can be quite tricky to understand the real sequence. Alternative lifecycle looks, there are other ways for the PostConstruct and PreDestroy. One is using, for instance, this interface, initializingBean and disposableBean. And in this case, you have to implement these two methods if you require both of these interfaces. If you want, you can only use initializingBean or disposableBean. It's not mandatory for you to implement any of them. But if you have to implement each one of them, initializingBean is after property set and disposableBean is destroy. By the way, if you look into this method after property set related with initializingBean and return back here, you can see the PostConstruct, which is created after this existed in Bean is called after all properties are set. It's a quite similarity. It's after property set, because this is the original name using this interface. PostConstruct is annotation that appear after, and maybe it's better for people to remember. PostConstruct seems more simple to remember than creating a notation called after property set. Usually we don't use too many verbs on the annotations because we try to be entities, and that's why it's called PostConstruct and not after property set, but they do the same. And of course, when we have classes or that are not beans, but since we don't control those classes, maybe we don't even control the code, but we would like to call the init method and destroy methods that they already have. For instance, in a connection could be something like open for initialization and close when we want to destroy the connection. And in that case, Spring Boot allows us first, when we don't control the class, to manage those classes. Of course, we should use bin, because we cannot add the annotation component or service. But Spring allows us to add these two parameters in annotation initMethod, which is the method that is the same as PostConstruct, which custom, meaning that after this bin is created, an instance of this class is created as a bin and injected with the dependencies, the Spring Boot will call inside the my service a method with this name. And when this bin before it is destroyed, the Spring Boot will call the method call it custom destroy before the bin is destroyed. By the way, these names here are not relevant, only these names. We can put whatever you want. It's not that you have to create a method called custom destroy. You can just call it whatever you want. Okay, even orange. It's not maybe it's not a good name for you to remember what is its purpose, but as an example, so you understand, you can have apple for init method and orange for destroy method. And you can see something like this. So our service, my service, like this one, which will be this one, okay, contains the custom init and the custom destroy. There is no reason to use annotation here, because when we use this annotation bin, it means that probably we have classes that are not managed by Spring, because if you can add an annotation, it would be better to put here component and PostConstruct PreDestroy. But since we cannot add the annotations, we prefer bin, init method, and destroy method. That's the parallel. It's the third way that we can use to add these hooks to our application. So this is just a summary of what we have talking about. So in terms of scope, PostConstruct, yes. PreDestroy, yes. Prototype, yes. PreDestroy, no. In prototypes, there is no call to the destroy. Request and session, which are scopes related with web Spring applications. A Spring application doesn't have to be a web application, okay, a Spring Boot application. So, but there are some scopes that only work in web. Those are request and session. Those can be participate in this PostConstruct and PreDestroy, but only remember that these scopes only work on web applications. So let's see, for instance, a use case, the prototype, this one that I was talking about. So imagine that you have a component prototype, and you can add the PostConstruct and PreDestroy, but this one will never be called because Spring does not manage these bins in terms of destruction of these bins. It doesn't cache them. Of course, it manages for a while because it creates and should understand the prototype, and maybe has to inject them in other bins, so it should understand the dependencies related with this bin, but it doesn't handle the destruction of this bin, so there is no PreDestroy. So you can add it, but it will be ignored. You can call it manually. By the way, if you have the instance, you can always call the method tear down, and it will call this. And you are sure that it will be equivalent to the PreDestroy, because the PostConstruct, this one is called by Spring Boot. Only the PreDestroy, it's not. Okay. As I was saying, we can use manual destruction like this. We get the bin like this, our worker bin. Imagine that our worker bin is a prototype, and then we can, for instance, call the destroy. Okay, this is another example about the configuration that I explained earlier about the my service. Okay, it applies to any Java object, not just components. Excellent for third-party classes. I would say legacy. If you are migrating for legacy, I will start to create the creation of my bins using this annotation bean and use this method for initializations and clean before the bean is destroyed. In summary, so PostConstruct simple init logic in Spring Beans. Try to go to this PostConstruct and PreDestroy approach if it's possible. Otherwise, you can use InitializingBean or disposable bean to create and the destruction, meaning to initialize and clean some data. But this one needs full programmatic control, and of course, you have to create the name of the methods are important in the which is not the case for PostConstruct and PreDestroy. And if you are working with legacy code or for third-party or external beans, meaning that are classes that you don't control the source or you cannot change somehow, in that case you want to use this bean because it allows you to manage these classes as beans without declaring them as beans. If that makes sense as what I'm saying. If you remember, when you use this bean, this class doesn't need to be a class that is known by Spring. It will be this annotation bean that will make this instance to be manageable. But the common managed beans are the ones that they have the component or service or repository and so on. And of course, you have always the option to manual destroy, for instance, for prototype or manual managed beans. So some practical advice: prefer PostConstruct and PreDestroy, as I was saying. For non-Spring objects, init and destroy methods, meaning use the bean in configuration classes. Avoid resource leaks by always handling cleanup. If you put the PostConstruct, don't forget to put the PreDestroy, if there are resources involved, of course. And combine with scope awareness. Remember that scope belongs, I will say that if you have to create a priority related with the life cycle of a bean, scope is the first one because it defines how long does this bean exist. And the things that we are talking here, it's things that we can, let's say, configuring during this life cycle. When it starts, call the PostConstruct. Before being destroyed, call the PreDestroy. So at the end of the day, the life cycle, the real life cycle, is done by the scope, which is the most important thing for you to understand. And during this scope, we can catch some callbacks or events that we call hooks with our PostConstruct and PreDestroy annotations, or init and destroy and other methods that we have. So further reading, I left here. There are other places, but Spring Boot, it's always a great documentation to read and very well detailed. I explain parts of it. I don't go more deep, otherwise it will be hours for each video. There are a lot to talk about. I like more, I usually follow an incremental way of explaining things. Sometimes I return to something that I talked in the past, but now I'll go a step further on it. So I will talk a lot about Spring Boot. Maybe I don't talk about that subject, everything on the same video. Okay. And Effective Java, it's a quite good resource for resource management. And Spring Boot best practice, it's something that you always should be aware. It's good practice and patterns that should be followed by people that already develop a lot in Spring Boot. So it's something that these are people that we should hear. Okay, so thanks for watching this. And now I will switch to my to IntelliJ and show you our application, and I will provide examples of everything that we talk about in this presentation. So I have here our application that I created since the first video. Sometimes I add some code, sometimes I removed code. You can find this in GitHub. You can see the post section in my channel. There is the link to the GitHub, and usually in 1 or 2 hours maximum, I will provide, after the video is uploaded, the GitHub code that I put here. And you can go further. In each commit, I put on the name of the commit the part, say part 25, part 26, part 30, and things like that. So you can reverse. And I put these as commits because sometimes I add class, other times I remove some of them. For instance, I created a few classes here that probably on my next video will not be here because it's just to show you some concepts, but they are not relevant to the application that we are developing. So, but in the comment, in the commit of the GitHub, you can see the description of the purpose of that part and what was changed on the code. So let's see our code. So let's start with a simple thing. So I created 2 or 3 beans here, and I had a PostConstruct and PreDestroy in some of them, and we should see some system out on the when you start the application. So let's start, for instance, with users repository. And users repository, it's a class that we use in almost all the videos that I create. It's about managing users. And you can see here that I created these two methods. One is the PostConstruct, initialize additional users. So it will add the user to the database that is in memory, which is the guest. Okay, and I will log, so you can see on the output. And before the bin is destroyed, meaning when we stop the application, we should see this message. The user will be removed from the table and the guest user deleted, and when it's created, guest user created. Okay, and this method is only executed when the application starts and when the application stops, unless I try to destroy the bin by himself. Okay, that's one of the places. The other one where I create, let's start with this one, and I will show you in a moment the other. So we'll start. We look into the output. And let's try to find the guest user created here. And you can see that we have here a guest user created in our class users repository. So the bin was created. Okay. Other bins that I created here, we can see the entity service. In the entity service, I use the approach using the implementation of this. So I'm not using the PostConstruct, but I'm implementing this interface InitializingBean, which is similar to the PostConstruct, and disposable bin, which is similar to the PreDestroy. And this is the destroy here. It's a method that I have to implement because of this one. And the InitializingBean requires me to create the method after property set, and I'm just logging, say, entity service destroyed, entity service initialized. So when the application starts, we should see this, and we can see it here. Okay, so it was also created here. This method was also called. Okay, and now I have created a configuration here, which is legacy beans configuration. And I created a class called legacy class. And this legacy class is quite interesting because it doesn't have any annotation. So it's not managed by bin. However, I want to manage this class by Spring Boot. And to manage it, we should create a bin like this. Okay, at least with this annotation. And return, and since it is managed by us, it's the only place where we do a new, and this new somehow will be translated to a managed bin. It's not bin, it's not the Spring Boot creating the instance, but it was in our responsibility, like new legacy class. But the result here, this instance, will be managed by Spring Boot because we put here bin. But since this is the case, so we cannot use in this class neither the PostConstruct, and we are not even implementing those interfaces to have the similar behavior for the PostConstruct and PreDestroy. And in these cases, we want to use this destroy method, and we name a method in our class, legacy class, that should be called destroy, that will be called when this bin is destroyed, and the init method, which is similar to the PostConstruct, and the name of the method that represents the PostConstruct. So let's see in our legacy class, we can see here that I have the destroy here, and I have here the initialization. So when the application starts, we should see this bin legacy initialization, and we can see here. And you can see another message here, which is bin legacy class created before the initialization. That's because this is what exists in this constructor. So I called the new, the instance was created, and then it was start to be managed. After this return, it's managed by Spring, and Spring, okay, I have a bin, so I will look for PostConstructs. It's not the case, you define it as a bin, so I will try to find a method called initialization and call it. And it called the method, as you can see here. So these are ways. And that's it for these three classes. So let's stop. I will clean this. So let's see what happens when we stop the application. And you can see that Spring Boot says, okay, it's a graceful shutdown, meaning waiting for active requests to complete if it's a web application. So there were no requests, so it just complete the application. And now it starts to call the destroys. Our bin legacy destroyed, which is this one, from our legacy class, which is managed by this bin, We have the entity services, which is the one that is using the interfaces. It is the disposable bin, okay, as the destroy method, and the guest user deleted, which is our users repository. Since I create the user here, now on the PreDestroy, I'm removing the user, so guest user deleted. And these are three ways to control the hooks and add some functionality after the creation and before destroying the bin. So let's see now an example for a prototype. From our previous videos, we created a kind of a bin called, which is a prototype called password reset token. It is when you want to recover a password, it generates a token, a GUID for instance. And it's a prototype because every time we want this bin, we want a new UID to be generated, okay, in this case. And we can see here on the constructor, it generates a random one, and it will with the expiration time of 50 minutes. It's not relevant for example, so you understand why I'm using this class. So it is a prototype. This prototype, it's not called when the application starts because it's not being injected in any of the managed bins by Spring, but it will be managed every time we call for a reset password. And for that I created here, this is the bin, okay, and you can see that I created here a PostConstruct and a PreDestroy. But since this is a prototype, we will never see this destroy, okay, and I will clean this. I will start the application again. Nothing will happen to this prototype. You don't see here on the message. If you download this application or use the GitHub and use the GitHub application, you won't see any of these logs here. So I will clear. So this is again a password reset token, and this prototype, it's called here on the password service. There is this password service when we want to reset the password, and it used the object factory to get the bin from Spring Boot, meaning I'm not injecting the bin, I'm just asking directly to the Spring Boot. You can see the object factory belongs to the Spring Boot for objects of this type. And this password reset token, it's our prototype. So I'm saying, okay, give me an instance of this bin, which is a prototype. And the Spring will look for this bin, and this register is a prototype. And if you want to see it again, you can see it's a prototype. It will call the constructor. It's not, I don't have it will call this construct, so it generates a unique identifier with an expiration date that will set it here. Later we can add an email about the user that is resetting the password. Apart from that, it's just a POJO. Okay, it will create all this, which means that it will call the PostConstruct because it's a bin managed for a while by Spring. It's not the only exception that it will not be destroyed by the Spring, which means that our password reset token, this init will be called because of the PostConstruct, but the PreDestroy will never be called because it's not destroyed. And by the way, this password service, it's called every time I think I should have it here. No, this is not a repository. I want the service, use the service. You can see that we have this reset password, which get user by username and then calls generate token, which will create our prototype. Okay, let's see this working. The application is running, I think. So I have already here an HTTP to call the reset password, which you call that service, and we'll create one of these instances. Let's see what happens here. When we get that bin, okay, this is the token generated. I will return, of course, the token that was generated. But on the output, you can see the PostConstruct was called. Password is a token bin created. If you look into this is what is here. But now if I stop, okay, you can see the entities, guest and bin that were created previously. The other bins are here, but you don't see this message, this PreDestroy. So be careful with the scopes when you are adding hooks to the managed bin. So these are the 4 examples that I explained earlier during the presentation, and this is the implementation. This code, again, it's on the GitHub. If you are just seeing the video, and I just posted this video a few minutes ago, probably it's not there yet, but it will in at least 1 hour, unless I forget. If I forget, please send me a comment, but usually I have on my to-do to follow it. So again, I'll present the 4 examples. I think by now you understand where can you use these in which scenarios, and the relation between the lifecycle scopes and these hooks, and why should you use them in your application even when you are migrating from legacy code. So I hope this video was useful for you. I hope you have learned something from it. I hope you like what I'm doing with these Spring Boot videos. So please subscribe, comment, share with your friends, and I hope to see you in my next video.